Whether you're picking up items in an RPG or pulling levers and pushing buttons in a puzzle game, interacting with the environment is often an important part of first-person games. And in today's video, we'll be covering how to do just that in Unity. As we get started, if you'd like to download the project from where I start in this video, you can get that on my GitHub, link for which will be down below. However, if you just want to skip the video entirely, I'll have the completed project available for download on my Patreon page. With that out of the way, let's begin. To start with, I've got a simple scene set up with some objects from a free asset pack that I created, link for which will be down in the description. I've also set up a simple first-person controller that allows you to walk, jump, and look around. On top of that, there is also a UI canvas for the HUD that has a small blank image in the middle as a sort of crosshair. The last thing I have that we'll be using is this quick outline asset from the asset store. It's free and it's super quick and easy to use. Links for all the assets I use will be down in the description. Alright, now to get started. The first thing I'm going to do is create a script called Interactable. This will be a short script that'll go on all the objects we want to interact with. Then we'll just want to open it up and edit it. We won't need update, so we can get rid of that. And for variables, we'll want a private reference to the outline component and a public string containing a message to be displayed when hovering the object. Lastly, to keep it somewhat generic, we'll have a public Unity event called onInteraction. To do this, we'll need to say using UnityEngine.events. If you're unfamiliar with Unity events, what this will allow us to do is call a bunch of different functions that we can set in the inspector, similar to how UI buttons work. Now, down in the start function, we'll want to get the outline component, and then set it to be not enabled by default. We'll actually pull this out into its own function, called disableOutline, that will return void. Then we'll also create an enableOutline function that just sets the outline enabled to true. We'll need these later in a different script, so we'll make these public. Now we just have one more thing we need to do, and that is create a public void interact function. And in here, we just need to say onInteraction.invoke. This will call everything that we set in the inspector. And that's it for this script. We can save and head back to Unity. Alright, back in Unity, I'm going to start with the money object here. Here we want to add two components, the outline and then the interactable script we just created. Then, before we forget, we'll want to head up to the tags and make a new tag called interactable. And we'll want to assign that to this object. This will be used later in our player interaction script. Now, in the interactable component, I'll add the message, something like pick up money. Then, down in the onInteraction area, we'll add an item, and in here I'll drag the money game object, and then from the drop-down select GameObject.setActive, and we'll make sure that's unchecked. This is just because we don't have any actual inventory, so we'll just disable it for now. Also, we want to make sure that there is a collider on the object, so that it will be detected by raycasts later. Now that we're done with the interactable setup, we need to move on to allowing the player to actually interact with these things. To do this, I'll create a new script called Player Interaction, and drag this onto the player object. Now open this up for editing. Alright, here to start off, we don't need the start method, so we can get rid of that. And now for variables, we'll create a public float called player reach. This will determine how far items can be from the player before they can be interacted with. I'll default this to something like 3. Next, we'll need to set up a private interactable called current interactable. We'll use this for storing which object the player is currently looking at. Alright, now down on update, we'll read an input. I'm just going to use keycode F. And then we also want to make sure that the current interactable exists, because in here, this is where we're actually going to call the interact. So then we'll say current interactable.interact. Now we need to actually set the current interactable somewhere. To do this, we'll create a void function called checkInteraction. This will call every frame before we read input. Now, how we're going to check for the interaction is by casting our ray from the center of the camera and checking if that hits. If it's an interactable, we'll want to set current interactable and enable its outline. If not, we'll do the opposite. To do this, we'll start with raycast, hit, hit. Then we'll make a ray equal to new ray with camera.main transform position and camera.main transform forward as arguments. This will shoot a line straight from the center of the camera. Now if we say if physics.raycast and use the ray we created and output to hit, and we'll limit that to player reach. Next, inside this statement, we'll check if hit has the same tag as that interactable one that we created earlier. And then inside there, we'll get a reference to this new interactable called new interactable. This will equal hit.collider.getComponent interactable. Now lastly, we'll check if the new interactable is enabled, and this is where we'll finally set the current interactable. I'm going to put this into a new function just to keep the code more readable and so that it's easier to change later. We'll call this set new current interactable and we'll feed it the new interactable. Now, down in this function, we'll set current interactable equal to new interactable, and then we'll call current interactable.enable outline. While we're down here, we should create a corresponding void function called disable current interactable. And here we'll check if current interactable exists, and then we'll say current interactable.disable outline and set it equal to null. Now, back up and check interaction. There are a few places we'll want to call disable interaction. First, after the raycast if statement, we'll say else disable interaction. This is if nothing is within reach. Next, after checking if the tag is interactable, we'll want to say else disable interaction. This is if the item we're looking at is not an interactable object. Lastly, after checking if interaction is enabled, we'll want to say else disable interaction. This is if the interactable we're looking at is not currently enabled. Now there is one last condition we'll want to check. This will be for disabling the outline if in one frame we're looking at an interactable, but in the next frame we're looking at a different interactable. This would happen if two objects are overlapping or are just kind of close together. Currently the outline on the first object would not be disabled. Where we'll put this is right under where we declared new interactable. We'll say if current interactable is not null, and the new interactable is not the current interactable, then we want to say current interactable.disable outline. Now save the script and head back to Unity. If we hit play, we should be able to walk up to the money we changed earlier, and yep, it gets outlined, and then when we hit F, it should disappear. Perfect. Alright, now all we need to do is display the message. First, we'll go onto the HUD and create a UI text. Then we'll want to drop it down just a little bit so it's just below the crosshair. Then we'll want to center it and change the font size. Perfect. Now we just have to control it. What I normally like to do for HUD UI is create a singleton script that we can call from anywhere that will change the UI. So we'll do that. Create a script called HUD controller, and we'll drag it onto the HUD canvas. And then we'll edit the script. And here we won't need update or start, so we'll get rid of those. And then to make it a singleton, we'll make a public static HUD controller called instance. Then we'll use awake and set instance equal to this. Now we should have a reference to this from anywhere. To be safe, we could do some error checking to make sure there's only one HUD controller, but we won't worry about that for now. Then we want a reference to the text we just created. I'm using Text Mesh Pro, so I'll make sure we import using Text Mesh Pro. Next, I'll make a serialized field for a TMP text called interaction text. Now we'll need two functions, enable interaction text and disable interaction text. Both will return void, but enable will take in a string called text. In enabled, we want to set interaction text.text equal to text plus some string for your input. I use F here. We could probably grab this from the input manager, but for now I'll just hard code it in. Next, we'll want to make sure that the interaction text game object is set to active. Next, we'll go down to disable interaction text, and all we'll want to do here is set the interaction text game object to inactive. Great, we're done here now. But before we go back to Unity, let's go back to the player interaction script and add calls to these in the appropriate places. Down in disable current interactable, we'll say HUDcontroller.instance.disable interaction right above the if statement. Then down in set new current interactable, we'll call enable interaction text right at the end, giving the argument of current interactable.message. Perfect. Now save and head back to Unity. And we don't want to forget to drag the interaction text we created earlier into the appropriate slot on the HUD controller. Perfect. Now if we hit play, everything should work as expected. Yep, and it looks like the text shows up perfect. Awesome. Now that the system is set up, you can use it any way you want. If you're going to use it for inventory items and pickups, I'd suggest making a new subclass that handles that, instead of using these events, but it's up to you. Now I'd like to show a quick example of something that this could be used for. I created this simple lever script that has an animator and two Unity events, one for up and one for down. Then in the scene, I set the interactable on the lever to call the toggle lever function. And from there, it calls the events I set up, which lower this little force field so I can get the money. Cool and easy, right? Well, that's it for this video. If you learned something, give the video a like. If you hated it, give it a dislike. If you really liked it, subscribe for more tutorials. I'm planning on making more RPG-related tutorials in the future, so stay tuned for those.